If you remember Deng Xiaoping, he was the second generation leader, the guy after Mao. He was probably the best leader that China has ever had because he realized what the strengths and the weaknesses of the Chinese system were, and he worked assiduously internationally to address the weaknesses and leverage the strengths. So he is the guy who met with Nixon and was brought into the American post-World War II, Cold War, international globalization structures. And that set the stage for the industrial expansion to create the China that we now know. And he wanted to make sure that they never had a repeat of Mao. So he personally selected not just his successor, but the following guy too. And that's Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. Between the two of them, they ruled China for 20 years, and that has been the golden age of China. But he knew that he was not smart enough to figure out who should run the country 30 years on. Mm-hmm. And so he left it to those two factions to come up with a compromise candidate. And the compromise candidate was Xi Jinping. Unfortunately for Jiang and Hu, Xi spent his first 5 years outmaneuvering them and gutting both factions. And then the second 5-year period, getting rid of anyone who might theoretically form a new faction. And so if you remember when he crowned himself president for life about a year ago, Hu Jintao was up on one of the desks on stage when it all went on, and they publicly escorted him out to underscore to the country just how there was no opposing power center anywhere, even theoretically in China anymore. It's just Xi. So Chairman Xi has now consolidated more power unto his person than any human in history. And as part of that purge, he has removed everyone from any position of decision-making within the Chinese system who is competent. And so it really is a one-man show. I mean, we can look at Russia and talk about he really only has half a dozen advisors anymore. And we can talk about Obama and how he locked himself into the White House. But Xi has no one. No one will bring him any information because they don't know how he will react. And he often reacts violently. And that's, shooting the messenger is not good for information flow. In this sort of environment, China has made a series of catastrophic mistakes over the course of the last couple of years. Wolf warrior diplomacy destroyed his relations with most of the world because now people, they're literally proud of their genocides in China now, and that does not resonate with anyone. We've got relations with the United States, which are their security guarantor for their trade and their primary consumer base, and the country that allows them to import all of their food and their energy that's just cheesed off at them completely. And they're even ruining relations with the Europeans over the Ukraine war. So one way or another, it has finally percolated up to Xi of just how deep in the shit they really are. So he sends out these peace feelers saying that, okay, we won't be quite so crazy. And Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, was on his way to the airport to get on a plane to come to China. But because there's no information exchange within the Chinese system at all, some dumbass in their intelligence operation said, hey, I got an idea. Because we're in a cult of personality and the great leader hates all things United States, I am going to float a 350 foot across balloon over the United States that you don't even need binoculars to see. And I'm going to dangle a chunk of apparatus that's as big as an Embraer jet. Now, if you've ever been to a regional airport, you know those well. They're the ones with 2 seats on one side and 1 on the other. They're very, very small. They're very, very cramped, unless you're dangling it from a balloon. And then it's going to spend 7 days going across the United States. We're not going to get any intelligence from this because the thing is, I'm going to send it over the missile bases. I don't know if you knew this, but unless you're actually launching the nukes, the missile silos are closed. And so there's no information that could be gathered from a balloon that you could get from a satellite. It is arguably the dumbest thing that I have seen any country do in the last 20 years. And the Chinese government, for the most part, didn't even know what was happening. Their Defense Department didn't know. Their foreign ministry didn't know. It's pretty obvious from the calls that Xi didn't know. It was just some idiot in the intelligence services. That is the degree of decision-making breakdown we are seeing in China today, that someone would think that this is a good idea and then not be able to stop because every bit of transmission it does, looking at what it does, learning the architecture, it will be the intelligence coup of the decade for the Americans. And at the end of the day, they're going to shoot it down and get the hardware too. So they're going to get the codes and the sequencing and the routing information, all of it. About the only advantage would be a mild strategic advantage because Taiwan is part of the first island chain, and those line of barrier islands that are populated that separate China from the rest of the world. And China's never been able to penetrate through through that in a sustained way, certainly not in a corporate manner. But they don't get semiconductors because the Chinese can't operate their own semiconductors. So if they suddenly found themselves in possession of the world's most advanced system, they wouldn't know what to do with it. It would be like a spaceship landing in the United States. And, we'd give it a good try, but we wouldn't have any idea what we're doing. It would lead to a military conflict that they couldn't win. Remember, the Chinese Navy, while it has a lot of vessels, under combat conditions, most, over 80%, can only sail about 400 miles from shore, and their oil comes from 5,000 miles away. So someone, Japan, the United States, Australia, Taiwan, Vietnam, India, someone will put 2 destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin and cut the energy line, and that is literally all she wrote. Also remember that China is the world's largest importer of food, and they import the vast majority of the inputs that allow them to grow their own. So you'd be looking at a deindustrialization collapse that would trigger a famine in a matter of months. And as of 4 years ago, the Chinese government realized that. So the Chinese went to a 2-China policy, and then a 3-child policy, and then they did away with it all. Yeah. And there's now no restrictions. And in fact, the Population Management Bureau, I can't remember the name of it, that's responsible for enforcing population controls, is now basically a neonatalist arm of the government who helps people have kids and helps them to try to find childcare and things like that. So, from a policy point of view, they've done more or less what they can without a complete upheaval, but it's too late. Too many people are living in condos, and so their birth rate is going down, 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 down. And then we had 3 years of COVID. And one of the many, many, many outcomes of COVID is when you're not sure of your economic future, you're less willing to have a kid. And the specific Chinese flavor of that is when you can't see your mistress every week, which is apparently really popular, your marriage falls apart. So apparently we've had this collapse in marriage rates in China during COVID. And then, of course, 3 years of lower birth rates. So from 2018 until the last data we have in 2021, the birth rate dropped by like 40%, even though they were liberalizing the laws on having kids at the same time. So it's just, we're so far past the point of no return now. So the one-child policy was adopted about 40 years ago, and Mao was concerned that this up-and-coming post-Korea, post-Japan occupation generation was going to expand so quickly that it was going to literally eat the country alive. And it has contributed now to the terminal demographic decline that China is in. But I don't think it's quite accurate, maybe a little unfair to put all of the fault on the one-child policy. It was, in time, proven to be a bad policy. I'm not disputing that. But when you move off the farm and into the town, you go from kids being free labor, and so you have as many as you can put up with, plus one, because that's how you find out it's too many, to kids being a luxury good and just the source of migraines. If you go back just to the 1950s, they were having 7 and 8 kids per woman. Now in the cities, it's less than 1. And obviously the one-child policy played a role in that, but just the urbanization process overall greatly depresses birth rates. And now we've got China, which is the fastest urbanizing country in history, did it in 40 years. And on top of that, they've got the one-child policy. So you put those two together, and the result is the death of the country. We're near the end.